This is Duke University.
I had the original title, and I think I even saw it on the website, was that I was going to talk about the future of transitional justice. And obviously in my position as the president of the International Center for Transitional Justice, I think transitional justice is going to be very important in the future. As long as we have human rights abuses, as long as governments fail to protect their citizens, and as long as legacies of abuse get in the way for respect for human rights. So I think, unfortunately in a way, transitional approaches like those that we follow at ICTJ and advise on will be an important part of dealing with the past and the future. Now, if you think about that, dealing with the past and the future, and you can see why I changed topics, it sounds a bit confusing, but we are dealing with the past to ensure that we have, dealing with the human rights abuses of the past to ensure that we have a future where human rights are respected. So I did, however, disagree a little bit with the title, and I changed it. And what I wanted to do is talk about something that I think is very important and I think is very apropos of what's happened to the landscape in the human rights world over the 30 years since the Nuka-Moss report was issued. It was really a seminal event, and in the 80s we saw a significant number of countries really transition from authoritarianism to democracy, and repressive regimes transition to situations where they had much greater respect for human rights and the rule of law. And I think you are right, very much so, to honor the Nuka-Moss report as President Alfonsine's very brave step in setting up the National Commission on the Disappeared ensured accountability for these massive crimes through what was really a seminally and groundbreaking truth-telling process. So as I talk about some of the challenges, and my speech is very much about some of the challenges that we face in the field of human rights and transitional justice, I think it's worth remembering and underlining that the hunger for justice when Nuka-Moss was released, over 40,000 copies of the first edition of Nuka-Moss was sold in 2 days. And if you look at the timing, the junta trials began within months of the issuance of the report. So it also led to a number of other steps to ensure accountability and address massive human rights abuses of the past in Argentina. But I think it went much further than that. It went beyond the borders of Argentina and actually beyond the borders of Latin America and impacted a significant number of countries around the world. While the early efforts to address the past, to address these massive human rights abuses started in Latin America in the 1980s, other parts of the world began to take that experience and take some of the lessons learned and some of these mechanisms and processes and use them in other parts of the world. And I think, of course, in the post-1989 Central and Eastern European situation, the transitions from authoritarian regimes to democratic states took place where they also took human rights seriously. Now, their approach was somewhat different as they addressed the abuses of the past in a variety of ways. They opened state archives, which is a subject that I talked with some of the students about earlier, and I think very important aspect of something that we can learn from Eastern Europe. Coming clean on abuses by the state, adopting lustration laws which expose those who committed human rights abuses, and shedding light on these abuses, these past abuses through commissions and other steps. In South Africa, we also saw a transition from an authoritarian apartheid state to a democratic one, headed by Nelson Mandela. And of course, this transition was marked and well known for the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as a number of other, I think, important and underreported processes, including reparations and memorializations. Now, obviously, the transition to democracy and the rule of law took different paths in these countries as well as others. Some societies were more effective in addressing the abuses of the past, but what we did see is an emergence of a variety of approaches that have come from these experiences. And these have primarily involved truth-telling exercises or truth commissions or commissions of inquiry. There have been some 40 truth commissions around the world over the last several decades. Criminal prosecutions, reparation programs, reforms, including of the security sector, reforms of the judiciary, and other parts of the government. And these mechanisms or measures, these approaches, truth, prosecutions, or criminal justice, reparations, institutional reforms, have been referred to as the 4 pillars of transitional justice. I fear and would argue that although I think this is a useful analytical formulation, I think it has engendered a much less admirable formulaic approach in some instances. Thus, in the hands of some, we have seen these 4 pillars have become a kind of check the box or formulaic approach, or paint by numbers if you want to be more illustrative. Whereas I think transitional justice is anything but formulaic. It needs to be responsive, and it really must be take into account the local conditions and situations. I think we have to take into account and underline that these processes are really driven by what we at ICTJ refer to as active social forces. By that, I mean civil society, as it's often normally formulated, victims groups, human rights activists, but I think also a wider group. Unions, for example, in Tunisia are playing a very important role in that transition. Religious groups, and that you can think of the church in Latin America and in Eastern Europe have played a very important role. And other social groups. This is really the demand side of transitional justice. So if I look at the situations where we're called to work and where ICTJ's help is sought, very few of them today really fit this kind of classic transitional paradigm of moving from authoritarianism to democracy that we saw in Latin America and Eastern Europe. The one that seems to fit that pattern more today that I would identify as Tunisia, which is undergoing a tumultuous transition from dictatorship to democracy, or authoritarianism to democracy under Ben Ali. And they're employing a number of transitional justice measures, including a landmark Truth and Dignity Commission, specialized human rights chambers in the court system, looking at reparations and various reforms. In Colombia, where I was recently with Kofi Annan, there are historic peace negotiations going on in Havana between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas. And a number of transitional justice measures are on the table, including a truth commission, prosecutions. Really at the heart of the discussion is who is going to be prosecuted for what. And there's a big, I think that's the key question in the Colombian negotiation, reparations and other reforms. As I said, I was in Colombia a few weeks ago to launch a joint study between the Kofi Annan Foundation and ICTJ coming out of the peace process. And we had examined a number of truth commissions that had come out of peace processes and studied them. And this attracted a great deal of attention. We had more than 1,400 people attend this meeting. President Santos, who's inaugurated and pushed the peace process, gave a very long speech. And in Colombia, transitional justice is on everyone's lips as one of the keys to addressing and pushing forward on the peace process. However, if I look at the other countries that we engage in and look across the world, I see very different situations. There are partial transitions or ongoing conflicts where we're asked to provide help. The DRC, the Congo is a good example. Simmering stalemates, as in Lebanon. In a number of cases, we have our supporters asking us to provide assistance, and basically this is to provide comparative advice and experience on transitional justice situations in failed states. Many are calling for transitional justice in places like Syria, where there's obviously open conflict, or where there's no transition, for example, in Uganda, or where there's very little political will for justice, Sudan, Kenya. So I would underline that I do think that transitional justice does have a role in these contexts, but it's very different from the one that it has had historically. And we have to be very careful to ensure that transitional justice is not being instrumentalized for some nefarious purposes, such as to avoid accountability or to use amnesties for serious crimes. I would also point out another element of what I would call these new demands or these new requests that we are being asked to help in situations where there are very weak or non-existent institutions. If we think about Latin America, if we think about Eastern Europe, if we think about South Africa, they had strong institutions, too strong in many cases. They were doing the wrong things, but much of the effort went to reforming or reconstructing those institutions so that they would be accountable in the future, so that they would respect the rule of law, so that they would respect human rights. Now, this is radically different situation than some of the other countries I've just named, where there are weak or non-existent institutions. So while I think these transitional justice approaches are relevant to these societies that have very weak institutions, I think a different and much longer term process is what we have to look forward, is what we have to push and we have to expect from ourselves. And that those carrying the banner of justice really have to work much more closely with other actors. I'm thinking here about the development community, because capacity needs to be built, the rule of law community, and a variety of other actors need to be engaged. So what I wanted now to do is turn to what I think is a more fundamental question that I think deserves all of our attention, and that is, at its heart, believe that transitional justice is about the fight against impunity. For fundamentally, transitional justice is very much about accountability and very much in line with Nuka Mas. That is to ensure that in the society where human rights abuses occurred, these violations will be addressed with a view to ensure that human rights will be respected and protected in the future. It does seem to me that for this to happen, to make recurrence much less likely, and to build a society that respects human rights, impunity cannot reign. So I would stress at the outset, by framing this struggle in terms of accountability and the fight against impunity, I'm not stressing necessarily or putting the emphasis on or primarily focusing on criminal justice. I think criminal justice or prosecutions is an important element in the fight against impunity. But so is truth. And arguably, some would argue that it is even more crucial. And the same could be said for reparations, which is the one mechanism that truly addresses and recognizes the victim's suffering and losses most directly. Moreover, reforms, not simply of the security sector, of the military and the police, but of a wide range of the institutions of states, including the courts and constitution, are important as well. In particular, I would note that ensuring justice for marginalized groups, and here I'm thinking particularly women, many who've been subjected to sexual violence as well as to endemic discrimination, indigenous groups, sexual minorities is really a key element in ensuring that impunity is followed. And also, I think it's important to take into account the special needs and situations of children, and I have in mind particularly the child soldier phenomenon. And I was very privileged to address the UN Security Council on about a year and a half ago on the child soldier phenomenon and the special needs and issues around children, which I'll be glad to discuss in questions and answers. So I think all of the measures and approaches are important because they ultimately get at different things. They address different underlying issues. So if we look at the fight against the impunity, there is a lot to be concerned about and a lot to worry about in our field, or my field of human rights, that after what I would admit is an imperfect but kind of tangible progress, where we saw progress from the time of Nuka Moss up until September 11 or thereabouts, we, I think, have gone backwards. You can call it what you will. I published an article, as I mentioned, in Project Syndicate, and they, of course, they entitled the article. I don't get to entitle the article, it's only my article. But they call it Wrong Turn for Human Rights. And so as we talk tonight, atrocities are mounting in South Sudan, Central African Republic, an epidemic of sexual violence in those countries and many more. We're witnessing horrific atrocities by Boko Haram, with only, I would say, a very token response by either the national authorities or the international community. The Nigerian president issued sent his condolences to Paris after the Charlie Hebdo attack, long before he did to the victims in his own country, who were much, much larger in numbers, and he waited 2 or 3 weeks. I think that's indicative of the situation there. And of course, the bloody handiwork of ISIL or ISIS is grabbing headlines, and there does not seem to be any kind of coherent strategy to address its barbarity. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the Syrian conflict is raging month after merciless month with untold civilian casualties, a divided Security Council sitting on the sidelines and doing nothing, reminiscent of Rwanda, really, and a lot of, and if you look at it carefully, Gaza struggles from another, I guess, up-teen destruction. Eastern Europe is rocked by daily attacks on civilian targets, and the world seems to have forgotten that a civilian airplane, and what was clearly an outrage, was shot down in midair with 295 people on board. And if we look here at the United States, we have to be frank. 3 months ago, we had the publication of the U.S. Senate reports, the Senate Intelligence Committee's partial, but I would say very damning report on the CIA's detention and interrogation program. And not a word has been said about bringing the perpetrators of torture to justice, much less giving redress to the victims. I could go on and on with this sober list. What I find so disturbing is that 30 years after Argentina's Nuka Moss, and more than a decade after the establishment of the International Criminal Court, shockingly, little is being done to stop these abuses. Perhaps, even more importantly, in the face of these atrocities, impunity reigns. Moreover, the prospects of victims ever getting justice, let alone bringing the perpetrators to account, seems to be ever so remote. And the response of the international community seems to me to be one primarily of lip service and chivalrous, powerful states supporting various groups of killers, whichever supports their interests, with only kind of a faint nod to human rights. And I very much express these concerns personally as well as professionally. I joined the UN to work on Palestine on the day the Oslo Accords were signed. I thought it was an era of peace building, and that I had joined the UN at the right moment. That has turned in the wrong direction. Uh, a few years later, I joined the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and I later sat across a jail cell desk from one of the principal architects of the Balkans tragedy, that's Slobodan Milosevic. And instead of his prevarications were then made from behind bars rather than from the halls of power. And in 1998, I sat in Rome when the Rome Statute was being negotiated for the International Criminal Court, and was pleasantly surprised and inspired by the agreement that was reached, but I was a bit nervous that the world did not really understand the implications of that step. I'm afraid the latter part of my concern has been ratified. Anyway, like a lot of human rights activists and supporters of my own generation, I was witness to some really key moments. Sometimes from afar, for example, with Nuka Moss, I certainly wasn't there, but sometimes much closer. And in the 1990s, I think we can honestly say that there was a decade in which there was an upswing across the planet in responding to massive human rights abuses. It wasn't enough, and I'm very realistic about this. One can recall the agony in the Balkans, the genocide in Rwanda, and many other abuses. And the international community responded in an agonizingly slow manner. You can ask General Dallaire or the dead of Srebrenica about this. But at least there was some response in these situations. And we saw the creation of the UN-backed courts and tribunals in the Yugoslavia and Rwanda and Sierra Leone and Cambodia. And a decade before that, that would have been unthinkable. The ICC, which now has jurisdiction over atrocities committed in 123 countries, was established to try cases referred to it by state parties or by the Security Council, and opened its doors in 2002. And the treaty, of course, was negotiated in 1998. And it's the first time that an international court has criminal jurisdiction over over a great part of the world to prosecute those who are responsible for the most serious crimes. Even a darling of the great powers, like former Chilean dictator Pinochet, was arrested in 1998 in London for violating the Torture Convention and began to tear the edifice off of the head of state immunity. On the national level, we saw 10 truth commissions that were established across a very wide geographical area in the 90s, as well as a number of other important initiatives, reparations programs, national prosecutions, reforms that provided a measure of justice to victims and accountability for some of the worst perpetrators. I would be the first one to say that these responses were fitful, they were erratic, and they were far from perfect. In fact, even with respect to the Nuka Moss report, the junta trials were later followed by the Full Stop Act, the Due Obedience Act, Menon's pardons in 1989, all of which blocked Argentina's struggle for accountability. Moreover, 3 members of the Security Council, 3 of the permanent members, the US, Russia, and China, have not ratified or acceded to the Rome Statute. Pinochet ended up returning to Chile and dying before he was convicted of crimes. And the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where I spent a considerable part of my career, I felt like I entered a young man with no gray hair, and you can look at me now. But I think it had a very impressive record, at least until recently. It prosecuted 121 individuals for serious crime, and there were national courts that brought to justice hundreds more. But again, those numbers pale in comparison to the estimated 10,000 perpetrators in Bosnia alone. Nonetheless, I think these and other efforts began to show that we were closing the impunity gap. And these efforts gave victims a voice, recognized their suffering, signaled to the culprits that their crimes would not be forgotten. And I think these efforts in the 90s and early 2000s deeply affected and in many cases transformed the public discourse for the better. And I would think it's fair to say that not so long ago, the moral arc of the universe, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., seemed ever so slowly, but to be bending toward justice. I'm afraid that today that is much harder to say. Instead, we seem to be going in many instances in the other direction, toward silence, toward amnesia, toward impunity. And it does seem that the international community appears to be backsliding on its human rights commitments. The world's emerging powers seem to lack any sense of urgency in addressing these abuses and really prefer to pursue narrow short-term interests rather than investing in long-term peace and justice. Now, to be fair, this is really a work of advocacy. I'm working you like I'm working other audiences across the country and in my articles and in our online debate. And there are perhaps some more nuanced views. Some are going to argue that if you take a longer perspective, there's a kind of gradual movement toward justice, that there are setbacks, but if you look at the big picture, the 20th century, late 20th century, and the early 21st century, when compared to the 18th or the 19th, is that we're moving toward accountability, that we're moving very gradually toward accountability for massive human rights abuses. Some will posit or argue that the fight against impunity is not really the right lens to look at this question, and instead that economic, social, and cultural rights should really come to the fore, and that the progress on human rights should be measured in those terms. Others may say that the focus of the argument is really too narrow, or that it doesn't take into accounts that advances that have made in recent years. And there are some bright spots, and I've talked about Colombia and Tunisia, and they've been on the economic and social and cultural development side of things. We've had the Millennium Development Goals, which have had a major impact in development in a number of countries and may ultimately rebound in the favor of accountability. And we do see some other bright spots. We've seen the recent resumption of the trials on Operation Condor in Italy, and Argentina and Chile continue relentlessly to pursue perpetrators of crimes against humanity. I'm afraid that I find these as relatively small victories against a backdrop that looks quite negative compared to a decade ago. To take this argument further, a few weeks ago on the ICTJ website, we took this topic further, and we posed the question, is the fight against impunity being abandoned by the international community? And we had a wide audience. We had more than 100,000 views. My communications people tell me that's a big number, probably the size of Durham, but still. We had outstanding participants, and I think this shows the level of concern in the human rights community. We had UN High Commissioner Zaid, who is somebody I have a great deal of admiration for. One of the big thinkers, Michael Ignatieff, who is an academic and was also the head of the Liberal Party in Canada. And I might say he's more pessimistic than I am. We also had the prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, the former president of the Open Society Foundation, Ari Nair, and Betty Murungi, who's a very renowned Kenyan activist and was a member of the Kenyan Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And some have argued, particularly High Commissioner Zaid, is that really the glass is half full, that there have been a number of advances in the Human Rights Council and on other fronts. There's the Habre case that's going on now for the former dictator Chad. And although they expressed concerns, they saw that the arc of justice going in gradually in the wrong turn, going in the right direction. What was really more interesting to me, because we had others that argued, Michael Ignatieff in particular, that argued that it really is a more serious wrong turn than Tolbert here says. So I'm somewhere in the middle. But I think if we really, I think most everyone agreed that a lot of the advances in the 90s, if you compare where we were heading in the 90s to where we are today, there have been some disheartening setbacks, and they do require and cry out to be addressed. We can't really be satisfied with the situation where we have disappeared in Mexico, as I said, many Nigerians being murdered with an impunity by Boko Haram. I'll just say Syria, and we have our prisoners having been tortured by our own intelligence agency with no accountability in sight. I think in an important sense, in the field of transitional justice, we're addressing the past for the future. And by that I mean that when the Argentine Commission on Disappearances some 30 years ago cried out "Nunca más," it was looking to the future. And I think that the states in Rome in 1998 echoed that same sentiment when they adopted the International Criminal Court Treaty. They were also looking to the future. So were the ICTR and the ICTY when they issued their judgments in the 90s and when the ICC was established. We were once again looking at past atrocities while looking at the future and saying, never again. Never will the international community stand by while mass murder occurs. Never will atrocities go unaccounted for. And here we are in this nice evening here at Duke, and I am asking the question, how can we revive or reinvigorate this fight against impunity? I think before we turn to the future, it's worth spending a few moments to look at what caused this wrong turn, what caused, or what were the underlying reasons that the fight against impunity has turned in the wrong direction, because that may help inform us of what we can do to reverse that course. And I have some tentative ideas, but one of the reasons I wanted to take this topic was to get your feedback and your not too harsh criticism, and have a bit of a dialogue here. This is my first audience where I'm trying out this debate. And it's one thing to do it online; it's another thing to do it in a live audience. So I think analytically we can certainly argue that understanding the underlying cause of the apparent waning commitment to human rights is key to finding remedies as well as setting our sights on a better course. Some voices, I think, would point to the attacks of September 11 and the ensuing fallout, particularly in the approach of the United States and some of its allies for taking such steps as extraordinary renditions, black sites, torture, and the other dark arts employed at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. The kind of alleged war on terror has certainly switched the priorities of the international community, really driving them away from accountability and towards an ill-conceived quest for security. And obviously the US-led invasion of Iraq had a lot of negative consequences. It broke, I think, the Western alliance and undermined the international rule of law, and it deeply damaged the US reputation regarding respect for human rights, much less competence. And moreover, it gave a great deal of potency to the argument of Western hypocrisy. And a somewhat related phenomenon, which I think is also important, is the rise of a more aggressive group of non-democratic states and their active disregard for human rights. And this factor, I think, is increasingly prominent and should be taken into account. Thus, we see Putin's pawns committing acts of aggression and emboldening tyrants around the world. I think we also must take into account and recognize the disappointment with the poor performance of the ICC as a factor. In my view, the hopes were too high for a single court in The Hague with a complicated mandate to hang on the entire responsibility for the fight against impunity. I find this reliance on the ICC as the principal factor in the fight against impunity impunity to be both misconceived on a couple of counts. The court was always intended to complement and not take over from national courts and judicial systems. I think we have to be honest with ourselves that for purposes of criminal accountability, that this has to be primarily at the national level, and we have a very long ways to go. So I say support the court. Indeed, I was in The Hague yesterday chairing a meeting trying to sort out some of the problems at the court. If I look tired today, it's because I went through Minnesota on the way back. It was a long trip, but I wanted really very much to be here at Duke tonight, and I wanted to be at the ICC yesterday. So I'm a supporter of the court. If we take the point a bit further, I think in light of the mass atrocities that are currently going on, many point to, and quite rightly, the very limited effect that the ICC has had. And it's a concern that I certainly share. Whatever our specific views, the critical question is, what is to be done so that never again starts becoming the norm and less the exception, at least moving back to the situation in the 90s where there were responses to massive human rights abuses. I think first we have to be honest with ourselves and acknowledge the primary innovation for taking on the fight against impunity and taking it forward must be at the national level. And it really must be led by this concept of active social forces that I've talked about. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has been advancing exactly in this direction of accountability on the domestic level, ordering national prosecution of perpetrators of state-sponsored atrocity. And this stance has had profound effects in Latin America. The Velquez Rodriguez case is just one example on a long line. Therefore, I think that the process in making progress on the fight against impunity is made to make it clear that the fight against impunity is not simply about the ICC, and more generally, not only about criminal justice. We really must be aware that a focus on the ICC alone is too narrow a lens to see the fight against impunity. The Rome Statute makes, as I said, it clear that the ICC is a court of last and very limited resort, and even a very efficient ICC, which we don't have at the moment, despite our good meeting yesterday, will be able to deal only with a handful of cases from any given situation. So I would put this on the table. Let's be clear that the fight against impunity is not limited to the ICC. And if the ICC stumbles, that does not mean the fight against impunity is somehow imperiled as well. As important as the ICC is, the fight against impunity remains primarily about national processes. Thus, if we're serious about criminal accountability, the complementarity principle must develop real teeth. At this stage, we see a great deal of lip service paid to this idea of complementarity, that the court is meant to complement national jurisdictions. But aside from a few examples in South America, I think that governments, national governments, are really waving the flag of complementarity to cover their own intended inaction. And I can point to a number of countries, whether it's Kenya, Uganda, or beyond, where if we look back in an earlier stage, Indonesia and the invasion of East Timor, no one ever having accountability for the Scorched Earth campaign. Moreover, I think donor countries, which really drive these processes, are not willing to expend either the political capital nor make the necessary investments to make national prosecutions a reality. So I'm really concerned that the principle of complementarity is in danger of becoming a charade. More fundamentally, in my view, we need to reframe the fight against impunity to take into account the centrality of victims and the best way to create stable democratic institutions and enduring peace. Otherwise, we leave many victims out of the justice equation. The fight against impunity is a very narrow struggle with the forces of human rights, leaving many important tools on the sidelines, including the rights to truth, the right to a remedy, and reparations. This is a case to be made, of course, that there is a case to be made that criminal justice should be broadened in its scope so that issues like pillage and exploitation of natural resources should be looked at. However, even if we were to expand the scope of criminal justice, we have to remember that only a limited number of perpetrators are going to be brought to the bar of justice. Thus, other approaches have to be evolved, and in particularly the needs of victims, which include, as I said earlier, reparations programs need to be recognized and acknowledged materially and symbolically. I don't think we can stress enough the importance of acknowledging victims, their suffering, their heroic struggle, and the fact that they've been wrong. Therefore, as much as criminal prosecutions are an essential step in the fight against impunity, it should never be the only one. Rule of law building, reparations measures, serious guarantees of non-recurrence, and of course, truth commissions are tools that have worked on the national level. How they are used and sequenced are going to depend very much on the ground on national actors. Needless to say, truth commissions have played an important role in many contexts, finding facts, identifying root causes of human rights abuses, proposing critical reforms, and in some contexts awarding reparations and uncovering important evidence for criminal investigations and trials. Moreover, they can transform our understanding of past violence by putting the emphasis on the victims. Finally, there are a number of measures that can be taken that do not call for major expenditure of funds, such as the annulment of sentences handed down against victims of human rights abuses on trumped-up charges, the removal of symbols and monuments that glorify perpetrators of atrocity or their regimes. You think of Spain in this context. Spain has monuments to virtually every human rights abuser in the Franco dictatorship period and in the Civil War period. And public apologies are also, by the relevant institutions, are also important. So while I think every situation is context-driven, I would argue that accountability, acknowledgement, and reform on the national level are generally at least as important as often symbolic prosecutions at the international level. Another key element in rethinking the fight against impunity is the need to bring together the intertwining elements of transitional justice theory and practice into better alignment. By this, I mean that we seek two broad aims in transitional justice. On the one hand, we're seeking a consolidation of peace and democracy. And on the other hand, we're focusing on addressing human rights violations through accountability to help reestablish the social contract between the citizen and the state and to restore civic trust. I would argue that these two propositions are complementary, that they combine the essential elements of human rights and justice in the context of political and social change. And in this regard, it is clear that impunity cannot somehow be the price to pay for political stability. It's difficult to sustain peace on the basis of a willed amnesia about the past or a renunciation of accountability. Challenging these assumptions may mean that we have better and difficult public discussions among political actors. But I think that long-term stability is more likely to be ensured on the basis of respect for human rights and addressing the past. And if we approach this argument, this ongoing debate about peace and justice, to advance the demands of justice depends on the possibility of extricating ourselves from the discussion, from the kind of political merry-go-round, and frame it in terms of the legal rights and obligations arising from universal principles of human rights. I think in that, if we take this view, we are much more likely to have peace and justice on the long term. I wanted to just take a moment before I close. I wanted to say a few things on a more personal note. We often think of human rights abuses or dealing with historical injustice as something far from home, that happen elsewhere. They happen across the Atlantic or in developing countries. They happen over there. We often think about dealing with the past is only with nations that are moving away from authoritarian regimes and onto the path of democracy. And although our primary focus at ICTJ is on countries that have experienced massive human rights abuses in the context of repression or armed conflict, many societies which are now more peaceful and operate at one level or another with the rule of law and democracy and so forth, have human rights abuses both past and present. I think if we think about the United States, there's a lot to answer for. And I'm not just referring to the torture report. As a North Carolinian who grew up in racially segregated primary schools, I've often been struck by the failure to address the history of slavery and segregation, one of the deepest and gravest human rights abuses committed in the United States. For example, there are museums and memorials to virtually every war, every cause, every prominent statements, including many slaveholders, but very little about slavery or its millions and millions of victims. There's a Holocaust museum, and it's a very good one, nothing against it, for the horrors that happened in Europe, but not much dedicated to the horrors of slavery, which happened in the US. This is now being somewhat rectified by an addition to the Smithsonian, but that's only happening now, 150 years late. In addition, many other historical injustices still wait and encompassing and profound official recognition, critical reflection in response to the victims. For example, the violation of the rights of people of Japanese descent who were interned in camps during World War II in the US has only been partially addressed. And I really can't help but think that our kind of willed amnesia about the past is partly to blame for what recently happened in Ferguson. The United States is not alone in this regard. I was in Spain this summer. I shared with the class this morning my speech about Spain and the crimes and abuses of the Spanish Civil War and the Franco's dictatorship cry out to be addressed. The same can be said in Australia or the US for that matter regarding past treatments of indigenous people, to give just a few examples. In closing, I wanted to just say a few words on how we might take this fight against impunity forward and find the energy to reinvigorate the fight. As I said, this is my first topic, so I'm testing out some of these ideas with you good people here at Duke, and my thoughts are somewhat tentative, so your questions either tonight or later will no doubt sharpen them up. But the question is what to do next. I think we must first acknowledge that the primary energy for taking the fight against impunity forward must, as I've already argued, be at the national level, led by active social forces, civil society. And to this end, in our debate, R.A. Nair made an interesting proposal. He suggested that civil society actors and key governments work toward a new Rome Conference for the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Rome Statute, which would be in 2018. And he suggested this be preceded by national and regional gatherings of civil society and other active social forces. He suggested that these meetings should really look seriously at innovations. He argued that in the 1980s and the 1990s in particular, justice proponents exhibited a great deal of innovations in terms of accountability, including the ad hoc tribunals, the concept and use of truth commissions on a widespread scale, the Rome Statute itself. Regional courts grew much stronger, and civil society groups at both the national and international level grew much more sophisticated. Nair suggests there are a number of ideas to look at. I'm not sure I agree with them, but at least he's putting ideas on the table. More ad hoc tribunals, and I'm fairly shocked that R.A. Nair reversed his long position, but he talked about the use of in absentia trials. So I'm thinking that we need this kind of energy and innovation, that they're critically needed. And I do think that the energy and innovation to take the fight against impunity forward is likely to come from the active social forces on the national level that I've been discussing. One thinks of groups of the Argentine mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the Bosnian mothers of Srebrenica, who have always bravely led the way. They will no doubt continue to do so. Well, I think international civil society, like ICTJ, but I also have my friends at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in mind. We have a role to play. I think the ownership and the ideas need to principally come from the societies grappling with this issue, these issues. They have the credibility and the on-the-ground knowledge. So we're thinking about how we might support this process. Obviously, ICTJ is a small NGO, so we can probably be no more than a catalyst, and that has been the intention of this debate and some of the ideas I put forward tonight. Nonetheless, it's important for the debate to move forward, to generate ideas to deal with this very real issue, and to put more ideas on the table, truly to innovate. So I look forward to your innovative questions and comments, and I would close with Nunca Mas. Thank you.
Keeping in mind the very transnational element of a lot of today's atrocities, how is that informing the strategies that your NGO and others in a similar field are using?
Not to be too simple-minded, but it seems to me one of the differences between the 90s and the last decade or so is that people's concept of barbarians were less active, and that what the excuse is, it seems to me, is that we have to do this because of these barbarians who are doing worse things, and that's how we have to respond to it. And 9/11, allowed that notion to surface. So that's one question: is what do we do about that? Because that seems to be the context for justifying the abandonment of human rights. And then there also seems to be a rise, and it did start in the 90s, of critiques of democracy. I'm thinking of Lee Kuan Yew, who just died, talking about Asian values. And to some extent, even though it takes a different form, it's the position of the Chinese government now. So I'd like your comments on both of those.
This is a little bit of a pushback on the little bit of the last comment you had about addressing monuments or, commemorations of people who had been perpetrators. This is broadly perpetrators, like in Spain, Franco's people, and I wonder. We have here in the Duke Human Rights Center and also in Durham, we have a project called the Pauli Murray Project, which is about this civil rights leader who was raised in Durham, and we have a number of activities around that. She was a Eleanor Roosevelt confidant and was a great civil rights leader in her own right. But she has this statement where she says, essentially, you have to embrace all of the past, not just the good stuff. You also have to recognize and preserve the bad stuff so that you can fully understand both the, Barbara's going to kill me, but the something and the degradation of our history. It's on a wall in Durham. I'll show you if we have a chance. But my fear about erasing monuments is that we then forget, or we're allowed to forget, that we did this, that we were capable of this. We also have a historian at Duke, wonderful historian of Nazi Germany named Claudia Kuntz, and she wrote an amazing book called The Nazi Conscience. And the very first line of that book is, the title of this book is not an oxymoron. They had a conscience. We don't agree with it. They had an ethics. They had a morality. Because so often people think, well, we wouldn't do that. Those bad guys do that, but we wouldn't do that. So I guess my question is, why erase even the Robert E. Lee's, like Robert E. Lee is at the entrance to Duke Chapel? Why should we chisel him out? Because he teaches us that we were capable of this at one period of time. So that's just a little comment.
I'll go in reverse order, I think. I'm not sure I would advocate for taking down the statue of Robert E. Lee, or Franco's henchmen, but I would advocate for being truthful about their role. So if you're going to talk about Robert E. Lee, then I think we need to demystify some of the legends about Robert E. Lee and what he stood for and so forth. And perhaps I would have no objection to putting a statue of Martin Luther King next to Robert E. Lee, for example. There may be other ways to do that. So I am in no way advocating the erasure of history. I'm talking about what I think I'm advocating for is a history that is closer to the truth, for lack of a better term. And I think if in societies that do memorialization well, there is a kind of, I think the Germans, for example, have done some pretty good work around this. And if you go across Germany, and there's a great article 2 weeks ago in the New Yorker, if you read it, by Elizabeth Tolbert, in which actually the article focuses on German prison guards who were being brought to justice very late in the game. But the part, I didn't take that part of it as, it didn't really catch my eye. But there was a German, an inventive German activist who was marking the last place of, I guess, of freedom for all of these victims who were taken off the street. So as you walk down the street in Germany, I've forgotten the German term, but there's a small marker to each of these individuals, and you trip over it. Let's hope you don't have lawsuits. I mean, I know I'm in the legal department probably, and here you might have a few lawsuits, but those kind of recognitions to me are much more important than what we do about Robert E. Lee. What troubles me is if we have Robert E. Lee and we have no counter narrative, and that's certainly what I grew up with. Now maybe the South is changing a bit, and to have and to not acknowledge what happened to Native Americans, not on slavery and so forth. That's really what I'm calling for. I don't. I think a more truthful version of history needs to come through memorialization and through our political process. And I think one of the things that, this is really a personal comment, but as I watch after 15 or 20 years away and turning on US television, this is a big problem. I mean, there's no context by anybody. And democracy is not simply, I think, about taking a stand in contrast to another person's or another group's stand, but it is in a way trying to grapple and come to some kind of common understanding. You're going to differ in some respects. I'm not much on getting victims and perpetrators together, but I do think that there's a lot of nuance to history, and we could approach it like that. Let's see if I haven't forgotten the other two questions. In terms of, yeah, I mean, I do think it's right, as you say, that there has been, whether it's in China, and whether it's in Russia, whether it's Singapore, there have been alternative kind of approaches put forward that take human rights out of the equation. And I think we have to struggle back against that, because those countries also ratified the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. They also undertook international human rights obligations. So there's a great deal of talking out of both sides of your mouth if you're ratifying these agreements on one hand, and if on the other hand you're talking about values that don't value human rights. And I think we should, and this is one of the points that I think is at least implicit in my talk, is that while we have to work with governments and governments need to change, at the end of the day, I would rather listen to activists, to civil society, than President Lee or the leader of China. They have a particular agenda, and so I think the support that we need to be giving and the energy needs to go to those forces that are in opposition. And if we take the South African example, then the support should go to Mandela and not to de Klerk and his forces. So I think there are always going to be these kind of counter narratives. And impunity is always going to have its advocates. It's going to be packaged in different ways, whether it's Asian values or something else. But I do think that the world has come together around certain universal norms, and that's what we need to be pushing forward. And leaders who speak out of one side of their mouth by signing those agreements and then do other things, that's what people like ourselves have to try to hold them accountable. And I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but I think it's important for us not to accept the arguments they put forward. Yeah, in terms of the question on ISIS and Syria and Lebanon, which I understand is I think you quite rightly say, is very transnational kind of organizations and committing crimes across borders. This poses a bigger problem that doesn't just exist with ISIS. I think it exists in a lot of other countries where you have weak states. Obviously, Syria is almost a collapsed state after you get outside of Damascus. Lebanon is a very weak state. And at the end of the day, if we're going to see human rights respected, I think we have to ultimately do that through states. So I'm not generally an advocate for military action, but to protect civilians, I think the international community has a duty to protect civilians. And so I think that there has to be a strategy to bring ISIS into line, and there needs to be a strategy of building states that can respect human rights. Now, I think that is not that's not a 1-year project or a 20-year project or a 100-year project. But what we probably haven't done enough of is analyze some of the causes of that and some of the legitimate gripes that I don't think that ISIS has, but that a lot of people on the Arab street have. And that's the Sykes-Picot carve-up of the Middle East. So much of the resentment, I think, is fueled by that. So in a sense, the past is very much fueling the conflict for the future. So I don't think there's, unlike a lot of politicians that you hear in Congress talk about an easy or quick solution, and the same ones who, by the way, talked about going to Iraq and being finished in 2 weeks and having everything run right. We need a strategy that looks on the longer term and is consistent with human rights values, not overly in an idealistic way, but that ultimately has to be the underpinning if we're going to see that those countries and those areas begin to turn around. So there's a military element, no doubt. There's a containment element, but a lot of this is, some of this is blowback over a long history. So I don't think there's a magic bullet here, but at the end of the day, by violating human rights, you certainly give a lot of ammunition to groups that don't believe in human rights. And that's part of what happened, because ISIS and so forth gained a lot from the US invasion in Iraq. They gain a lot every time a case comes up about Guantanamo Bay. This is a tremendous recruiting tool. So countries like the US and others, if they respect human rights, I think on the longer term, we're going to be in a much better position to push back against this.
You didn't respond to my question about sort of the rationale, how you deal with, the barbarians are doing worse things, so there's now apparently 3,000 agencies in the United States that are totally unaccountable, that are dealing with terrorism. And or that white support for the police has gone up since Ferguson, apparently, on the grounds that, maybe they screwed up a little, but that's what we need to contain this kind of thing. That seems to be a popular argument.
On the national security state, activists like you and me need to be pushing back very strongly. I mean, I think that's our role. The media has to be much stronger, the democratic institutions in the country. I mean, what's happened is there have been no checks and balances against a kind of runaway security state. And I think the blame lies not just with the people who've done it, but for the citizenry to kind of stand by. Now, I don't think you turn that around in a week or a month, but I mean, I think you have tools to fight back with, and activists have a lot more tools than they did in the past in terms of being. I mean, if you look at what Snowden did, if you look at what a number of activists have been able to do, and surely you've seen Citizen4, that's had a huge impact. But I think we have to build on that. I think that's ultimately a struggle that needs to be carried on by democratic activists, and it also means voting and marshaling the powers that you have, exposing these things. So I mean, it's a long-term fight, and I think that goes on because we've been dealing with a national security state for 75 years now, and it's waxed and it's waned. But I think that's the role of civil society. I think you have to hold the government accountable, and in a democracy, even a flawed one, you have certain tools to work with. What's your solution?
Asking for.
I'm just playing with you a little bit. I'm having fun here. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
No, I'm asking for ways you've combated that in practice,
Yeah.
In particular, because
Well,
that
right
kind of fear
row.
is very powerful.
Right here on the front row, I had a really interesting conversation today. That's something I didn't really know about, and that's extraordinary renditions out of North Carolina, taking dozens of people out of the country illegally, and you have an activist group right here, which I'll recognize. And I don't think Pat McCrory, is that his name? The governor of North Carolina. How did North Carolina ever end up with a guy like the name Pat McCrory, much less his policies? But he needs to be taken on and by activists like yourselves, and I think some of the work that you're doing is exactly what needs to happen. Also, I think probably some of us activists sometimes avoid the ballot box and say there's no difference between the two parties, and so I think you may have found that not to be true here in North Carolina from what I'm reading and hearing. So I think the friend of these groups is the lack of action and the kind of sit on your hands attitude on the other side. So I would encourage you to be active, and I was very encouraged to hear what you're taking action on a kind of local scale to address a serious international problem. I mean, these are the people that inspire me, not the people in government.
I have a couple questions about Colombia, which
Sure.
might be stuff for us to talk about later too, because I probably have some very specific questions. But you mentioned it as one of these bright spots, and so I was wondering, in the conversations around truth commissions right now, who the proposed participants are. Is this just the FARC? Is this looking at investigating state responsibility as well? And then is this looking at, what do you do in cases where you have these armed actors that are theoretically demobilized, like the paramilitary? So if you could speak more about that, and maybe, and that might be afterwards, but in a larger question, what are your thoughts about truth commissions and their role in this sort of post-conflict legibility
Right.
and what that says to the international community? Because Colombia's already gone through 2 sets of transitional justice, 30 different historical memory reports. So what will this add to the equation?
I would say, though, I mean, it's true that there have been a lot of processes in Colombia, and they always make them very complicated and very long. It's no accident that Gabriel Garcia Marquez was born in Colombia, I don't think. Dealing with the Colombian authorities is a little bit like one of his novels. But I do think it's historic in the sense that the momentum to deal with the largest group, the FARC, I think, the most serious group, seems to be making a lot of progress. And I think there's some and we talked about innovations earlier. It's not perfect, but bringing victims to the table in Havana, I think was a pretty, I don't know whether it was our idea or somebody else's, but was a pretty good way to approach this. And I sense, and I may be wrong on this, but by bringing the victims to the table, they changed the tone of the conversation, particularly with the FARC. I mean, what I hear after the victims coming, I think they had a real impact on the negotiators. Now, I suppose if we were cynical, we'd say they acted like they acted like it impacted them. But I have the sense that that may be the case. So I would say I'm hopeful in the sense that the negotiations have gotten to a point where both sides probably are so in danger of losing face that they almost have to go on. You know? Santos is very invested in this, right? It's very difficult for him to come back. FARC has given up a number of things. That doesn't mean it can't collapse at the 11th hour, but and I think if it does collapse, it'll probably collapse over criminal accountability. You know, what makes this so complex is you now have the ICC and the prosecutor, and you can't make a deal and then have the Inter-American Court undo it in 5 years because you've got the ICC prosecutor. So we're in a lot of uncharted, territory. But I think if you can end the longest-running conflict in the world, or certainly in the Americas, 50 years, right? That would be that's worth our investment in the process. What does a Truth Commission add? I guess that's your real question. What does another Truth Commission add to all of these other processes? Well, I think if we thought like Colombians, it'd be kind of like adding another Gabriel Garcia novel. You need it because you can't finish the process without going through it again. But from what I'm hearing and seeing, I think there are elements that will be taken up in this process that probably haven't been covered in others, and a lot of it will depend on the choice of the commissioners, which that's not clear yet. But I think you also need to bring together all these other efforts that have been going on, the various reports, the memory unit, et cetera. By bringing that together, I think maybe you have a better chance of closure than not. And I'm glad to talk about the other multiple, but I can be here until next week trying to figure out Colombia.
One thing that I thought about when you said the moral arc appears to have shifted since about 9/11, maybe a bit before, maybe a bit after, is how the world itself has also changed, probably starting a decade before, in terms of the corporate multi-state.
Yes.
And so we've all become, first of all, they're these massive multinationals. They were always some big ones, but now they are gigantic. Secondly, we've all become clients of them in various ways. The electronics that we're connected to, the numbing effect that the news has over time of atrocities that we now have brought into our living rooms every single day. And so it feels to me less that the arc is bent than that it's become adrift, that there's a sort of outsourcing of moral rage.
Right.
We don't even have drafted military anymore. We have professional armies. We've outsourced the pain to people we will never see, most of us in our own social classes. So are there any very big corporations that may offer some kind of ray of hope? For example, some of these are headed by, especially from the dot-com world, billionaires, some of whom do have aspirations to make the world better. Do you have a sense about that, and do you come into contact with them? Is there a way to marshal them if we're ensnared in them?
I think there are two aspects to your one aspect of your question is a more pedestrian element. You didn't raise it, but I will, and that's what's corporate liability for in these conflicts. And in our debate, we had James Stewart, who is an academic, and he's been arguing pretty strongly for corporate responsibility, for pillage. If you look at what's going on in West Africa, this is all related to natural resources. It's driven by corporate interest and nothing, there's no accountability on any kind of sense, either. Obviously, the national authorities are entirely too weak. The ICC is probably too weak but doesn't have the tools, and it's difficult to hold them accountable extraterritorially too. So I think that is an important issue. It's a subsect of section of what you're talking about, which I think is a much bigger question. And you know, the world has really changed, and I think we in the human rights world are running behind, and I don't think we have developed the tools or the alliances that are necessary to move into this new world. And I think it's tough for activists to start teaming up with multinationals. I mean, there's a kind of aversion to that, but I think you're probably right on the longer term. As states hollow out, and we see this more and more, that we have to find mechanisms to both engage and try to hold accountable corporate interest. And I think we're really in the infancy stages of recognizing that. It's some of the big heroes of activists are actually corporate titans, but they're wearing blue jeans and calling themselves, I didn't. Steve Jobs wouldn't come to mind, but some others probably would. But I think there's also another dimension to this, which I mentioned Citizen 4, Glenn Greenwald, and others have, they're developing tools on the other side to address, to just kind of seek accountability from both governments and corporate interests. And so I would also look to, and this is part of what I was trying to get at in terms of innovation from the human rights community, trying to figure out how to negotiate through this world where, you're right, states have decayed to some extent. Civil society is no longer constructed in the way that we saw. The post-war order is kind of falling apart. We need to think in much more innovative ways, and we need to think much in real time has speeded up so much. So I think we're in the really early stages of even beginning to talk about this. But your question is spot on, in my view. And until we grapple with it in a more serious way, I think we're going to continue to be running behind. So I'm looking forward to your paper on this, Professor.
Well, thank you so much, David.
All right.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.